I'm an Italian curator. I live in Sao Paulo in Brazil since 2001, so 15 years. It's the second year that I do the Walkie Talkie. This year is with Roberto, who is a young collector from Sao Paulo also. And we selected 4 booths to talk a little bit about a few artists that we find interesting, and also about, I mean, especially Roberto selected artists that he wanted to talk about, and I selected a couple of booths basically for other reasons, not just for the artworks, but because of the relation between the artworks, which is something that interests me as a curator, and for the fact that one of the galleries is showing a Brazilian artist from the 70s who is really unknown even in Brazil, and that's something that I find interesting, that people can see in a fair completely on the other side of the world.
I'm Roberto. I'm 45. I apologize for not speaking Italian. We started collecting. I'm an engineer, and I started collecting to see the world from a different perspective. And as such, every single artist that we look at gives us the opportunity to look where we live from a different point of view. So we like artists that are Indian, or and we are going to see from Lebanon. We like artists from Greece. Obviously we like from Brazil, and so we live there. And the Brazilian artists that we collect, they give us the chance to challenge the certainties that we have in life, and that's why we choose them, and we choose all the artists that we look for, and that's what we're going to see hopefully today.
So we are here at the booth of a gallery that has 2 spaces, one in Hamburg in Germany and one which I would say is the most important in Beirut. The gallery is called SFEIR-SEMLER, and the director is André SFEIR-SEMLER. And we're here basically to talk about this work, or this artist. This work is a work by Rayan Tabet, who is a young Lebanese artist, and this work is part of a series of works that he's been doing for the last years about the Trans-Arabian pipeline. The Trans-Arabian pipeline was the only man-made construction that went through all the countries of Middle East. So at the time when it was done, that included Israel, Lebanon, Syria, all countries where nowadays there is basically no communication. So this was stopped due to all the political uncertainties in the region already in the 70s, if I'm not mistaken, or end of the 70s. And then Rayan in the last few years has been researching a lot about this history, about the history of this construction. It was a huge pipeline that would bring oil through all the Middle East. And of course he's investigating that because of his interest in stories from our recent past, especially from Middle East, but also because of all the social, political, and even poetical implications of doing something in a region where nowadays you cannot really even conceive doing something like that.
What I like about his work is essentially, I think, and first and foremost, is the fact that he researches a lot. This work specifically, this Trans-Siberian company, was a great idea. And it was a great idea not only for the Middle East, but also for countries like Brazil, where we're always thinking about great projects that will link us to the future. But at the end of the day, they never happen. And that's exactly what took place here in this case. They had a perfect idea of creating a pipeline that would be the shortest distance between Lebanon and Saudi Arabia. However, I mean, due to all the political instability, it never happened. And at the end of the day, a perfect idea, I mean, failed miserably. And this work here, it's another idea that, I mean, in a world where we didn't have emails or any digital media, it was great. I mean, each one of these colors actually represents a city. It's how the correspondence or the mails were distributed between the different cities where they had offices throughout the pipeline. And once it was dismantled and the company went to bankruptcy in practical terms, it was completely forgotten. Ryan researched and found actually the main office and collected all these postcards that where the mail started and ended. And that's the essence of this work, where everything starts and everything finishes, but in this case, miserably failed. And that for us as Brazilians, it represents a lot. I mean, Brazil is known as the country of the future, but it's a future that never happens. And that has been going on for, I don't know, 3 decades or 4 decades now. And this is a work from the Middle East, but talks a lot for us. So that's why, I mean, it's actually a pizza that we own. So that's why we end up buying it.
In the same place where he found those things, he also found a lot of other material from this company that is part of other works that he created. Like he found the letters that were written, the how do you say, with the header and footer of the company. So he made a series of works also with material that he appropriated from this place that was completely abandoned.
This work here is from Shilpa Gupta. Shilpa is from India. I think most of her work, and that includes the work that she did last year in the Venice Biennale, as well as the previous ones, talks a lot about borders, both the ones that exist and the ones that do not. In this case, here in particular, what I like about it is she researched it once again. I mean, we like it about works or artists that research a lot, and she's one of the cases. In this particular case, she researched many stories from people, and people from all over the world. So when you look at this series, and it's a very large one, this is just a small set of it. We have stories from people from the Middle East. We have stories from people from Scotland. We have stories from people from Europe. That essentially, in every single case, they lost their identity, and for different reasons. I mean, either because of political reasons or because of wars. All those people had to leave their country and move somewhere else. And in this case, here, whenever they arrived at their new country, they received a new name, they received a new identity, and in some cases, that identity was, for lack of a better word, a crazy one. It was one that, in one particular story that I don't remember exactly in which one of the series it is, but for example, it's good morning in the language of the country that they arrived in. So, when we look at the moment that we are living in, all over actually. I mean, here in Europe or in the US and even in Brazil, I mean, the refugees or the immigrants, it's an extremely important subject. And she reflects that not only in this series, but in many of hers. The work that she presented in the Venice Biennale talks about a very local and spot discussion between India and Bangladesh. And in that frontier, there is actually a gap of loss. I mean, in the frontier between the two countries, there is essentially no law at all because neither the laws from Bangladesh or the laws from India applies. And that's this work talks about. I mean, it's a clear division of and a very clear border set up, and in each one of the pictures there is a history linked to it, based on the story of the person that picture was taken from.
My impression is that you always relate these works to Brazil, but my impression is that the artists in Brazil are not so involved in political, with very, very few exceptions. Most of the artworks that we see nowadays don't reflect in such a direct way on the context like the work that you seem to be interested in. So the question is whether you agree with me, and also why do you think that is?
I agree, and actually I agree. I think that when you think about Brazil, you think about the concretism or the neo-concretism, yeah, abstract art. But we don't. I think that most of the new generation of Brazilian artists, they tend to focus more on local issues. But that I think it's a mistake. I mean, in my opinion, I think that Brazil, it's still a very closed economy in all the different senses, and that's reflected in its art. So this new generation of artists, with a very few exceptions, I think they talk about global issues, or they insert themselves in a more broader term. I think most of them are still, unfortunately, look more inside than outside. I agree with you.
So now I would like to go right here at Co Gallery, which is a German gallery. Basically, Roberto selected two artists that they collect and that they're interested in. And the first booth that I selected and that I wanted to talk about is this booth, or more specifically this part of the booth, because the booth continues on the other side. Because I really like the combination. I think this is one of the best booths in the fair for me. And it's two artists. The video that you see are by Clemens von Wedermeyer, who is a German artist, and he's an artist who usually, I mean, often or basically always works with video. And he's done several videos where he actually reenacts. So he's the director of films that reenact historical episodes that very often are not so clear. You don't really know if what is displaying is actually what happened or no. And even at the time when those episodes happen, very often things were not really clear. You might have seen two of those videos of those films that function in that way in the last Documenta, if you had the chance to see it. And this specific work here is a work that doesn't function like that, because what it does here is appropriate excerpts from films, from Hollywood films, and then it just mounts them again in a way that is fascinating, because it's basically one video that is repeated, in this case 4 times. He has already installed it with 6 or 7 videos altogether, always with the same 6 seconds gap between one and the other. And basically all the films, all the excerpts from films talk about sculptures. Now you see a lot of statues and sculptures, and this is in itself already interesting, I think, because obviously video is a new media which is nowadays totally assimilated by the contemporary art scene, but in a way it always relates with sculptures and paintings and other more traditional medias. But then the interesting relation here is between these in a way funny or meta literary, if you want, take on sculpture, and these sculptures here, which are also exactly like the film, done of fragments. This is Michael E. Smith, a younger artist from Detroit, and basically all his work is made out of fragments. And this is something that you immediately associate with the idea of a post-industrial society, of which Detroit is obviously the most iconic example that we have in recent times. So it was the cradle of US motor companies, as you know, and then in the last years it was completely emptied out because of the failure of that industry. And then what he does, he takes fragments from several things and he combines it with new materials and he does new assemblage. So apart from liking it from a formal point of view, I think this is a very well thought booth when you can really see how the works relate. As I said, Roberto is a collector, I'm a curator. So as a curator, I think I'm more naturally interested in the way the artwork actually relate one with the other instead of just talking about one work in itself. Of course, it's a combination of the two, and but this is a very well thought booth, I think, and that's why I wanted you to see it.
What I like about this last booth that we visited as a collector was actually the link between sculpture and film. I mean, because at the end of the day, whenever we have a director of a film and that he's working with the actors, I mean, ultimately he's in a very small fragments of time, he's creating sculptures. And the piece that Jacopo showed was several fragments of sculptures in movies taking place at the very same time.
This was a real surprise for me, this booth. This is a very small gallery from Vigo, from Spain. And the artist, they only have one artist here. And this artist is an artist that I personally know because I've been doing a lot of research about the Brazilian scene in the 70s and 80s, but I'm sure Roberto didn't know until yesterday, probably. And he's really not well known. And I mean, apart from talking about the works, which I think are very interesting, I want to highlight the fact of the importance that the art fairs, in a way, have nowadays. This is a series of works that was just hidden somewhere in the drawers of Gabriel Borba, and Francisco, the gallerist here, was doing research in Brazil and he found them out and he brought them to here. So this is something that even people in Brazil just haven't seen. And we have here two videos. One is called Me, which is the one upstairs, and the other one is called Us. And in these videos, I mean, these videos relate quite well with a series of other videos that were done in Brazil in the mid 70s, which were basically the first videos ever done in Brazil. There were basically two schools, so to say, one in Sao Paulo and one in Rio, and it was a very, very specific thing. I mean, people just didn't have any machine. So these two schools were basically the artists who were friends with the people who had a machine to a video camera to record things. So Gabriel Borba was part of the Sao Paulo group, which gathered around Walter Zanini, who was the director of the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sao Paulo at the University of Sao Paulo. That was then all throughout the 70s and the beginning of the 80s a very, very important place in Brazil, because it's basically where all the conceptual practices happened in Brazil. And this was also a place where people were very active, I mean, as far as you could actually be against dictatorship in Brazil. So this was, and Gabriel Borba, in the mid 70s, actually started working at the museum, and he worked 30 years at the museum. When I arrived in Sao Paulo in 2001, he was still working there. So that's where I met him at the first time, without even knowing he was an artist at that time, because he then stopped producing. And this installation here is an installation, you can then look at it carefully. It's recording of a performance, if you want, where he paints the fresco by Leonardo da Vinci, The Last Supper, on this big canvas, and then he sits in front of it just with other people to take a picture where everybody is standing right in the position of the fresco, and then he paints it all white again. And this is, for me, a very interesting reflection, both on painting and traditional painting, which in the small work on paper there, you could see that it was an interest, a specific interest of Gabriel Borba and a few other artists of the time, but especially on the way the artwork becomes nothing in the end. As you know, in the 70s, one of the main discussions was about the need to abolish the physical presence of the object, so the dematerialization of the art object, especially because those artists wanted to go against the market. So it's in a way funny that we see that in the context of an art fair. But this is also a very specific take on that. So basically what's left of the whole process, which we can assume took several days, is just these sets of photographs.
I mean, not particularly related to this work, but I see in many young countries this trend of reviewing artists that are from the 70s or the 60s that are now taking place. And I always, and I've been questioning why that takes place. And I think that one of the reasons, for example, Gabriel, I mean, as we were discussing yesterday, and indeed I was surprised by his name. I've never heard of him, and he was definitely one of the first video artists in Brazil, and therefore extremely important for breaking, I mean, a trend there. And I question why I didn't know about him, or why I've never heard about his work. And I think that this trend that is taking place is also about us, from our current perspective, looking back and revisiting what has been done in the past. I mean, what has a guy like Gabriel did, and not looking from the 70s perspective, but from a 2016 or 2020 perspective, and seeing how a work like his, that actually I like it, makes sense. So I think that's an important effort that we should all do, and look back and revisit what has been done before, and why now, but why. I mean, I think it's an important effort that we should all do, always.
I agree. I think the younger countries are doing it now because more established places have probably been more active in that sense. Yes, but there's still a lot to discover in Brazil, in Latin America for sure, and hopefully we'll see more of this. Yeah. So thank you very much. Thank you.